So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Gómez, who received her Ph.D. from the University of Michigan and is currently assistant professor of American art at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She specializes in the art of Latin America, and her research focuses on the visual culture of Indigenous and Black people in colonial Lima, Peru. Her work recovers non-elite ways of thinking by making use of archival evidence and considering the visual culture of the Andes in West Africa in analyses of European artworks. Her scholarly and teaching interests also include popular images of the Virgin Mary, miracle working images, and the activation of the pre-invasion and colonial past in contemporary Latinx art. I met Ximena Gómez a couple of years ago in Washington, D.C. We were both fellows together at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts. And I first encountered Ximena's research in this context. And I was, we had many a conversation about how to look at European artworks, Euro-American artworks, and sort of work against the grain using archival documents and incorporating Indigenous perspectives into those paintings. And Ximena has done this just wonderfully in her research. So I think you're really in for a treat tonight. Today, she will discuss devotional images of the Virgin of Copacabana in colonial Peru. With that, welcome, Dr. Gómez.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. There we go. Okay, so again, thank you so much, Annika, for the kind introduction and for this wonderful invitation to speak at Joslyn virtually. Before I continue, I too want to acknowledge the land. So as a professor at UMass Amherst, a land-grant institution established by the sale of the homelands of 82 Native nations in multiple states, I am complicit in the historical and ongoing project of settler colonialism. I speak to you today from the traditional homelands of the Pecumtuck Nation, who lived here for thousands of years before the British invaded. I'd also like to acknowledge our neighboring Native nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. This is still Indigenous land, and it will always be Indigenous land. And with that, we're turning now to South America. Maybe. There we go. Nope. Now. So. The Virgin Mary was no mere tool in the Spanish invasion of the Americas. She was one of its key players. Christopher Columbus's devotion was so fervent that Marian imagery pervaded his infamous voyage for the Indies. In the Andes, the Virgin is said to have come to the aid of the Spanish forces led by Francisco Pizarro in their battle against the Inca. The Inca chronicler Felipe Huamampome de Ayala depicted the gentle violence of the Virgin in one of these apparitions in Cusco, where she threw sand and dirt into the eyes of indigenous soldiers, causing them to literally fall to the ground. It is no surprise then that the Virgin was everywhere in colonial Spanish America. Among the Virgin's many manifestations in the Andes, none is more popular than the Virgin of Copacabana, who we see here on the left. The miraculous nature of the statue, paired with the institutional support of the Augustinians, resulted in the dissemination of the Copacabana title throughout the Viceroyalty of Peru in a wide variety of media, as evidenced by the Virgin of Copacabana in Lima, who we see here in the center, and the painting at Joslyn Art Museum on the right. A painting like Joslyn's is an important source for art historians of the colonial Andes, since it serves as a much needed reminder that these sculpted images were never meant to be seen as I have them pictured here, which prioritizes the intention of the artists, but rather meant to be seen covered in luxurious clothing, jewelry, wigs, and flowers placed on them by pious devotees. This calls to mind Richard Trexler's assertion regarding miraculous images, and I quote, "I wish to stress how mistaken we are when we describe these images as if they were in a museum, stripped to the bone and divested of all the ornaments of clothing and honors with which they were earlier dressed. In fact, they had clearly owed their so-called miraculosity to these features, heaped on them by rustic legends, power-seeking rulers, and other devotees, end quote. My talk today is interested in the ways colonial indigenous Andeans were able to redefine and mobilize visually European images by ritually heaping on adornments. With limited control over the titles of their virgins and a real necessity to adhere to colonial norms of adornment, we might imagine that indigenous people in colonial Peru were drawn less to a static sculpture and more to the dynamic nature of dressing and presenting it. We will begin by discussing Yupanqui's Virgin of Copacabana and statue paintings like Joslyn's before focusing on the Virgin of Copacabana in Lima, the subject of one of the case studies in my book. Whereas we frequently know very little about a colonial artwork's devotional community, my research has revealed the Chachapoya ethnic identification of the members of the Lima Virgins Confraternity. And a confraternity is an organized religious group of lay people who are drawn together by their shared worship and social support. I will analyze the Lima statue, especially the ways in which she was ritually dressed, but also the miracle she is said to have performed in 1591, through an anti-colonial lens that prioritizes Andean ways of thinking. We shall see how confraternal ritual engagement through activities like dressing the statue allowed the Virgin of Copacabana to operate as a nexus for disparate religious traditions. By examining the Virgin of Copacabana, it will become clear that even when interacting with a European-looking object through Catholic ritual under colonial rule, indigenous histories and beliefs could flourish. So we begin today in Lake Titicaca, situated in the central highland Andes in what is now Bolivia near the southern border of modern Peru. The story of the Virgin of Copacabana's creation begins with the Inca. In an effort to control their quickly growing empire, the Inca populated areas they had newly conquered with mitmacuna, people forcefully resettled from elsewhere in the empire, as a means of disrupting the delicate social balance of an area and suppressing rebellion. The traditional Andean pattern dictated that the indigenous people of a region were anansaya, or upper, whereas newcomers, the less privileged, were urinsaya, or lower. However, as conquerors of the region, the Inca invaders, along with their mitmacuna, became anansaya, displacing the indigenous population. This pre-1532 reversal of Andean organization precipitated the social discord that continued to play out in the late 16th century. According to a retrospective account of the cult's origins written by the Augustinian friar Alonso Ramos Gavilan, by 1621, drought had been crippling the Titicaca region for some time. The two major groups in the region competed to enlist the support of a Christian saint against the drought by founding a confraternity. The Urinsaya chose Saint Sebastian, while the Anansaya chose the Virgin of the Purification. Francisco Tito Yupanqui, an Inca noble, decided that he wanted to produce a statue of the Virgin of the Purification on behalf of the Anansaya. Due to Yupanqui's authorship and the sculpture's origins in an area very sacred to the Inca, his virgin gained a markedly highland Andean valence, a connotation perpetuated by both indigenous and colonial Spanish channels. That Andeanness is so carefully enfolded into the story of the Virgin's making indicates that the association of image with Andeanness was deliberate, while at the same time closely linked with clerical concerns about the indigenous fabrication of Christian religious images. Since Yupanqui produced the sculpture only after seeking help from a Spanish artist and looking to a Spanish object, the foundation legend asserts that the Highland Virgin of Copacabana was an Andean creation. European aesthetic principles and modes of making served as the guarantors of appropriateness and worthiness in a locally manufactured Christian sacred image. An image cult like the Virgin of Copacabana, generated out of Spanish colonial religious orthodoxy and Highland regional religious culture and politics, offered the Lima confraternity a potentially safe religious context or frame for integrating and expressing supernatural beliefs and structuring social interactions. So Yupanqui's Virgin, as we're seeing her here, however, would not look familiar to her colonial or contemporary devotees. Following Spanish tradition, polychrome wooden statues were rarely displayed unadorned with their materials of manufacture fully on display. In the colonial period, as now, Peru's sacred images were difficult to discern from beneath continually changing layers of adornments. Even images with fully carved clothing, like Yupanquis, were ritually adorned with mantles, wigs, jewelry, veils, and more. Statue paintings like those we see here bear witness to the importance of these adornments. A popular genre in the colonial Andes, statue paintings depicted sacred images, mostly of the Virgin, dressed and adorned, standing on their respective altars. These paintings were produced mainly for private use and served to spread the fame of a particular cult statue throughout the viceroyalty. For modern scholars, they also provide a means of recovering the material culture and devotional rituals of early colonial devotees. They must be interpreted with care, however, since these paintings often included fictive elements in order to produce an image that was unique and hovered between the real and supernatural. Statue paintings of Yupanqui's Copacabana usually look like the painting in the center. They place the Virgin in her distinctive silver and mirror niche, embedded into an elaborate wooden altarpiece. She is most often adorned with a crown, flowers in her loose brown locks, holding a candle, referring to the fact that she's a virgin of the purification, and wearing a sumptuous dress and matching mantle that's affixed by long strings of pearls. Her adornments are consistent with Augustinian chronicler Antonio de la Calancha's early colonial description that, quote, "It was custom at that time to dress images of the Virgin with clothing, skirts, and head coverings in the style in which noble women dress," end quote. The practice caused concern for the church, causing the Second Lima Council to issue a decree expressly prohibiting it. The later dates on these paintings make it clear that the decree was clearly disregarded. What drew Andeans to dress their sacred images when it covered the work of the artist and put them at risk for punishment? Looking to Seville, where the tradition of dressing these images originated, Susan Webster has argued that the extravagant adornment of sacred images was popular because it allowed devotees to participate in a realm of power, prestige, and glory that once had been exclusively reserved for royalty. Maya Stanfield Matsey, meanwhile, suggests that dressing contributed to an ever-changing image of the statue as divinity. Thus, cloth's nature as a transformative medium provided colonized Andeans the opportunity to use their decorative goods to curate manifestations of the divine that suited their religious experiences. As we can see in just these three paintings, however, there is significant variation from painting to painting, reflecting the uniqueness of each devotional community. The Virgin in Joslyn's painting, for example, looks very similar to the Virgin in the center, but does not hold a candle and has many of the attributes of the Virgin of the Rosary of Pomata. The feathered crown, the flowered arch, and the rosary are all common to her paintings. If we look closely at the undressed parts of the Joslyn Virgin, so her face, hands, and the Christ child, it becomes clear that what we are seeing is a Copacabana statue who has been dressed up to look like a Pomata, or a Virgin of the Rosary. While it is not clear why her devotees chose to do this, Joslyn's painting speaks to the way in which adornments can supersede a statue's original title. Considering that most colonial sculpted virgins are based on European statues and have European titles, we can conclude that the Andeans placing the adornments onto them had the power to redefine them. In other words, a sculpted virgin that is European in title is rendered Andean through the clothes, jewelry, and flowers placed on her by her devotees. So by contrast, the Virgin in the painting on the right, which is actually the Lima statue, holds a candle and is labeled as Copacabana, but her face looks totally different. She sports a veil rather than long hair and lacks many of the adornments usually associated with the title. In order to understand why this Virgin's adornments are so distinct, we must leave the highlands for Lima, the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. The city was founded on the banks of the Rimac River in 1535 by Francisco Pizarro and his small band of Spanish invaders, and quickly grew into the largest city in Spanish South America. The indigenous community that would found the confraternity dedicated to Lima's Virgin of Copacabana originally resided in a multiracial neighborhood known as San Lázaro. On November 1st, 1588, quote, Indian shrimpers and Chachapoyanos and those that reside in the Corral of San Lázaro by their own will and in order to aid their souls founded their confraternity, end quote. That the Chachapoya group explicitly identified themselves in the founding document is of special interest, as it signals that the identifier held some kind of stable meaning, ethnic or otherwise, and that those who claimed it had a sense of themselves as a distinct subgroup within the confraternal community. We must learn a little bit about them in order to analyze the decisions they made regarding the adornment of their statue. In the colonial period, Chachapoya referred to the societies that flourished around 1000 CE at the juncture of the northeastern Peruvian Andes and the upper Amazon basin between the Marañón and Huallaga rivers. We unfortunately know very little about these people, and what we do know comes from Inca sources via Spanish chroniclers, which we must treat with care since the Inca and Chachapoya were enemies. Indeed, the very name Chachapoya was imposed by the Inca, believed to derive from the Quechua words sacha, which means tree, and puyu, which means cloud, likely in reference to the cloud forest that Chachapoya inhabited. This difficult environment was described in the early colonial period as, quote, very rugged and wet land. All year it does nothing but rain, end quote. At the same time, here, the Chachapoya were well poised to access a wide range of natural resources, resulting in incursions from outside forces as well as interchange. Ceramics found in early Chachapoya archaeological sites such as Manachaji and Gran Pajaten, for example, provide evidence that the Chachapoya were mediating Andean-Amazonian exchange. We might imagine that occupying a physical and cultural crossroads in Chachapoyas equipped those who emigrated to thrive in the multi-ethnic, multiracial environment of Lima and be accustomed to incorporating different visual traditions into their own. A period of population growth, settlement nucleation, and artistic fluorescence around 900 CE saw the development of classic Chachapoya culture. Their circular stone houses with pointed straw roofs were located primarily on mountaintops, peaks, and ridges, and appear to follow the landscape in their settlement patterns. Chachapoya settlements primarily consisted of freestanding buildings, most of which were houses for single families. Ritual and communal structures were present, but were notably comparable in scale to the houses and were set apart by distinctive additions. These additions frequently were stone mosaic friezes, usually geometric, but sometimes also figurative, as in the case of Gran Pajaten. These designs offer some insight into Chachapoya religious and cultural beliefs. Federico Kaufmann-Doig has speculated that the zigzag motifs represent lightning, rain, rivers, and ravines, and that shapes resembling wave crests are a symbol for a deity that reigned over atmospheric conditions. These symbols then allude to the preeminence of water, and especially rain, reflective of the region's uniquely wet climate. The zigzag has also been interpreted as representing snakes and condors, which the chronicler Inca Garcilaso de la Vega identified as a sacred animal and the primary deity of the Chachapoya. The rhombus, another common motif that has come to be representative of the Chachapoyas region, has been understood as evidence of their veneration of big cats like the jaguar. The Inca initiated their conquest of Chachapoyas around 1470 as part of Topa Inca's expansionary campaign. The Chachapoya fiercely resisted the invaders from Cusco, but were ultimately incorporated into Tawantinsuyu, as the Inca Empire was known, after much bloodshed on both sides. On account of the Chachapoya resistance during the initial period of conquest and their subsequent uprisings, the Inca responded harshly, enacting significant changes purposefully aimed at disrupting the region and reorganizing it for Inca administrative convenience. A central aspect of this campaign was the implementation of the Mitma policy of forced resettlement. As much as half of the Chachapoya population was dispersed throughout the Inca territories, including Lake Titicaca, where Copacabana is, the Mantaro Valley east of Lima, the Lucumayu Valley northwest of Cusco, and to Cusco itself, where they served as palace guards alongside Cañari people who were being similarly punished. The Inca repopulated the Chachapoyas region with loyal Inca settlers and other Mitmacuna, including a group from Huamachuco of the northern coastal region and another of Huanca people from the Mantaro Valley to produce ceramics. Having only recently suffered defeat and relocation, the Chachapoya infamously sided with the Spanish in their invasion of Tawantinsuyu. The Chachapoya, along with the Cañari, who had similarly rebelled against the Inca, came to be considered by the Spanish as friendly Indians, serving as guards for Spanish magistrates and enjoying a number of privileges in the colonial world. They were designated as nobility, were exempt from tribute or corvée labor, claimed lands, and could not be granted to Spaniards for tribute labor, to name just a few of their advantages. In early colonial Lima, they were especially valued for their loyalty. For example, as José Carlos de la Puente Luna has shown, almost all of the interpreters general of the Audiencia of Lima in the 16th century came from Chachapoyas, beginning with Juan de Alvarado, who was appointed in 1555. The Chachapoya at the time of the conquest and their descendants in perpetuity lived exceptional colonial lives, and the Chachapoya confraternity members in San Lázaro were no exception. The role the Chachapoya played in the Spanish invasion and the special rights they earned, however, also led to an antagonistic relationship with Inca people well into the colonial period. Esteemed art historian Carolyn Dean has uncovered evidence of ethnic conflict between the Inca and their former guards, the Chachapoya and Cañari, playing out in the late 17th century on the canvases of the renowned Corpus Christi paintings from Cusco. That this was occurring more than a century after the invasion speaks to the importance of indigenous ethnic identities in the colonial world, as well as the enduring memory of the Andean world prior to the Spanish invasion. In the late 16th century in Lima, barely a century after the Inca invaded Chachapoya land and 50 years after the invasion of the Spanish, these conflicts were fresh, within living memory for some, and were almost certainly playing out throughout the city and in the dynamics of the Copacabana confraternity. By 1588, Chachapoya people had settled in the Lima neighborhood known as San Lázaro and were part of the founding confraternity that, around the same time, commissioned the statue that would be the focus of their devotion. Notably, the founding confraternity members did not give the confraternity an image the title Virgin of Copacabana, as she is now known, but rather chose the title Virgin of the Repose. By the time the confraternity was being founded in 1588, indigenous Limeños had almost certainly heard of Francisco Tito Yupanqui's Virgin of Copacabana. Additionally, the Lima Virgin is a virgin of the purification, like Yupanqui's, suggesting that even early on there may have been an interest in visually aligning the Lima image with the Highland Copacabana cult, even if they didn't choose that title. A scant 2 years after the founding of the confraternity on August 30th, 1590, Viceroy Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza gave the order to relocate San Lázaro's indigenous residents to the Cercado, which was Lima's designated indigenous settlement, while Archbishop Mogrovejo was away from the city. The mandate was executed under the cover of night and was marked by acute violence. The indigenous residents were forcefully taken from their beds, stripped naked, scalped, and whipped, while their houses were burned to the ground to prevent their return. Learning about these events, Archbishop Mogrovejo was furious and had a small chapel hastily constructed in the Cercado for the newly displaced community, in which the Reposo confraternity met to refound their group. And it was at this time that the confraternity renamed their image the Virgin of Copacabana. Yeah, there we go. Notably, the founding confraternity members did not give the confraternity an image the title Virgin of Copacabana, as she is now known. Nope, we're just doing this again. This is where we want to be. As we know from confraternal inventories and can see in the statue painting, the Copacabana confraternity dressed their Virgin in keeping with typical colonial practices. In dressing and changing the statue, confraternity members would have manipulated the voluminous fabric as they enveloped their virgin, dressing an image that was a potent act for colonial confraternity members, both because of the intimacy of tactile interaction and because the image's presentation reflected on the confraternity. Without texts, and especially without the actual textiles used to adorn the statue, we are severely limited in our understanding of the Virgin of Copacabana in Lima, and it is impossible to know for certain how the Chachapoya devotees understood it. But if we take an anti-colonial approach, which would have us apply a Chachapoya perspective to our analysis, we can speculatively recreate the indigenous knowledge and experiences erased by colonialism. For example, we might guess that while ritually placing clothing and mantles on their virgin, the Chachapoya confraternity could have drawn parallels with their ancestral weaving and mortuary traditions. Although the Chachapoya had a diverse range of processes for preserving the dead, bodies were usually situated in a compact seated position, wrapped in a combination of vegetal fiber cords and woven textiles. Adriana von Hagen and Sonia Guillen's extensive research on the mummies found at the Chacha Inca site of Laguna de los Cóndores found a large cache of bundles wrapped with cotton cloaks, reflecting influences from neighboring traditions, some embroidered with typical Chachapoya frieze designs and a few with embroidered faces. Practices of ancestor worship were powerful throughout the Andes, causing mummies to be targeted by Christian extirpators of idolatry. Obviously, in the colonial world, and especially in Lima, indigenous people could not safely recreate their funerary practices, and they were compelled to adapt and modify their rituals. The colonial confraternal context is particularly significant in this regard, since funeral arrangements were traditionally one of the main responsibilities of the confraternity. Given the importance of funerary traditions and ancestor worship in the cultural memories of the confraternity members, these practices were very likely to have been retained in cultural memory and recalled. Chachapoya burial practices were integral to their cultural identity, not unlike the way the Virgin of Copacabana served as an emblem of the confraternal community in Lima. Consequently, though a mummy bundle bears no ready visual parallels to the Virgin, for those confraternity members dressing the Virgin, the action may have incited an elision of the dressed Virgin with Chachapoya ancestors. Von Hagen and Guillen's research also found evidence of mummies that had been rewrapped, indicating repeated and extended tactile interaction between the living and the dead. Such rituals would have reinforced the parallel with the dressing of the Virgin, so the robes with which the confraternity members dress their cult image can be compared typologically with Chachapoya ceremonial textiles. Let us take, for example, this tunic that features components of classic Chachapoya images that can be found in different combinations on other extant tunics. The tunic has a geometric embroidered design on the top left, seated felines on the bottom right and on the belt, two sets of splayed male figures with various objects in their centers against the orange fields, and the figures on the right are topped by front-facing felines. In creating the vivid design, the weavers of this tunic employed a mix of techniques: warp-faced plain weave with supplementary warp floats for the supernatural figures, brocade embroidery and Chachapoya assembly style, which is two panels stitched up the sides in the middle. And while the end result is a visually stunning and iconographically complex object, the use of various processes was equally appreciated by viewers accustomed to finding meaning in the creation of an object, as was the case for the Chachapoya, who were revered for their textile traditions. An emphasis on the process of creation over the visual of the final product occurred in Chachapoya architecture as well. Chachapoya houses conveyed status not through materials, but through the way materials were assembled and the size of a structure as a result of a person's social capital. Moreover, Inga Schellerup and others have identified the proliferation of shared architectural methods and symbolism as a manifestation of Chachapoya ethnic identity. These experiences and modes of viewing in the northern cloud forests could have extended to the colonial Limeño context, allowing the confraternity's Chachapoya members to perceive analogies between the different cultural traditions of assembling and dressing of sacred subject objects. Barely a year after being relocated to the Cercado, the confraternity's fortunes shifted again. On the morning of December 28, 1591, the Virgin of Copacabana is said to have performed a celebrated sweating miracle, drawing people from throughout the city, filling the church with not only the residents of the Cercado, but Spaniards and Afro-descendants as well. News of the miracle spread to Archbishop Mogrovejo, who immediately began the proceedings to authenticate the miracle. Due to the Archbishop's quick move, an account of the miracle and events that unfolded over the course of the day is recorded in rich detail through a series of eyewitness reports. The majority of the 40 testimonies collected were provided by self-identified Spaniards, who consequently dominate the miracle story. While deeply biased histories are the rule in the colonial world, the fact that the Limeño Virgin of Copacabana belonged to an indigenous confraternity especially calls the Spanish account into question. Since the authentication materials were produced by ecclesiastic authorities and were ultimately reviewed by Archbishop Mogrovejo, the report is a carefully orchestrated document that reflects the biases of its generators and did not align with the desires or motivations of the confraternity. I would argue that indigenous witnesses were purposefully excluded in an attempt on the part of the diocese to control the miracle narrative. By framing the miracle narrative with non-indigenous voices, the Spanish secular clergy would have been able to avoid potentially heterodox interpretations of the miraculous event, perhaps based in indigenous traditions. The nature of the miraculous flow of water, for instance, would have resonated deeply with the Chachapoya confraternity members. They might have recalled a religious object like the monolith from Pumachaca near the modern city of La Jalca Grande in Chachapoyas. The stone sculpture has a small channel across its back through which the spring sacred to the people of the area ran, according to a 16th century religious informant. When the Virgin of Copacabana began to produce water on the day of the miracle and became a font of sorts, the Chachapoya confraternity members may have recognized the origins of their ancestors as they did in natural elements like springs, mountains, and some animals. The Virgin's production of water may also have been especially potent in the humid desert climate of Lima, where it only rarely rains, a far cry from the constant downpour of Chachapoyas. Though such an association would have probably served only to increase a Chachapoya viewer's affinity to the Christian image, it would still have been suspect and unwelcome in colonial Lima, especially in documentation destined for Spain. The authentication documents also, fortunately, left us with testimony from Cristobal de Ortega, the artist responsible for the Virgin of Copacabana's polychromy, who reported that he saw the Virgin's face más encarnado, or more incarnated, and not with as much shine as he had left it. The term encarnación, which literally translates as incarnated or enfleshed, but also refers to the process by which painters applied the subtle flesh tones of a sculpture. Thus, with this description of the Virgin on the day of the miracle as más encarnado, Ortega inserted the Virgin into a long history of Spanish images that miraculously transformed to appear real or enlivened. Ortega was not alone in noticing the change that occurred in the image's face. The priest celebrating the Mass too described the Virgin's face as different than how she usually looked. For indigenous witnesses of the miracle, like the Chachapoya confraternity members who must have been present, the visible change in the Virgin's face would have elicited distinct associations rooted in their own traditions that are more difficult to pin down. The Virgin's transformation from wooden image to living woman fits into a long history within Andean visual culture of objects decorated with scenes of transformation. While the Virgin of Copacabana did not undergo an extensive change of the kind illustrated on several extant Chachapoya objects, we can speculate that the noticeable change that took place in the sculpture's face could have been understood through this lens. A pyro-engraved gourd found in Laguna de los Cóndores is understood as depicting a scene or scenes of transformation in a Chachapoya religious story. The gourd is decorated with 5 figures, each in various states of transforming from or into feline-like figures. Even the two figures that appear most complete, figures A and D, are in a state of flux. The first with a snake metamorphosed tail, and the second with only 3 toes. Adriana von Hagen dates the gourd to before the Inca invaded Chachapoyas in the 15th century, but this does not mean that the iconography was later lost. A tunic we see here, likely dating to the Inca occupation, found on a mummy bundle of a Chachapoya nobleman, displays similar iconography along the neck slit. The creation of these ethnically plural objects speaks to the endurance of Chachapoya ethnic markers. If these images were not lost under the Inca, we should not assume that they were necessarily lost when Chachapoya people were in Lima and saw the face of their devotional image in the cercado change before their eyes. This talk has demonstrated how the indigenous Andean adherents of the Virgin of Copacabana in Titicaca, Pomata, and Lima were able to assert the unique identities of their devotional communities through engagement with a supposedly European figure. While Catholic traditions and Chachapoya funerary practices are distinct, both the Virgin and the confraternity members' ancestors served as fundamental generators of community and facilitated emotional ties. These associations would have been especially encouraged by the parallel traditions of ritually dressing the Virgin and ritually wrapping and rewrapping mummy bundles. As many aspects of the confraternity's actions seemingly illustrate, Christian and indigenous visual traditions easily commingled in the sculpted Virgin of Copacabana and were accommodated in the rituals and devotions of the confraternity. This opens up a number of possibilities for new interpretations of colonial art. Because colonialism is responsible for a lack of visible hybridity in Lima's extant art objects, as well as the physical loss of indigenous material culture, an art historical rejection of the force and legacy of colonialism in Lima and the rest of Peru must involve not just looking for the invisible, but looking at the invisible as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gómez. This is so fascinating, and I have a million questions. I do want to make sure that all of the participants can ask questions as well. Please type them into the chat, and I'll moderate. Ximena, you can check as well. Please type your questions into the chat, and just to get things started, I do have a question about the painting and we don't know the name of the artist. There's very little documentation on the painting in our records. I was noticing the other statue paintings you were showing us, there weren't artist names for all of them. What can you speculate about who this painter might have been? Would it be fair to say that they were potentially indigenous? Were they part of this confraternity? And so curious to hear your thoughts.
Yes, so chances are they probably were indigenous. It looks very similar to a lot of other statue paintings that were painted by Cusco school artists. So the Cusco school, it's basically, we're talking about moving in the like 17th, 18th century in Cusco, which was the Inca capital. It's in Peru. You have these people who, like, finally indigenous people were allowed to paint. And there are certain aspects about their painting that you see a lot, including seeing, it's kind of like a flatness, a lot of attention to detail. So probably they were from there. It was probably someone who was commissioned to make this painting after a local image. So what I was saying is that it was probably what happened. Well, there are two things. Either there was a statue, a copy of this statue of the Virgin of Copacabana that someone redressed as a pomata, right, of the Virgin of the Rosary, or they decided someone asked for a painting of the Virgin of the Rosary, and this person was like, well, I know what the Virgin of Copacabana looks like, and I know that the Virgin of Pomata wears feathers, so maybe that's what she looks like, and painted her that way. But either way, it's this like ritual dressing, either by the painter or by devotees that get to define this statue.
Awesome. That actually answered a second question I had about what the painting is represented. And you said it's either dressed by the painter or dressed by the devotees, which is just fascinating that painting becomes part of that ritual practice. Okay. So here are a few questions. This is a great one. Can you describe the event of ritually dressing a statue?
Yeah, I mean, as far as like, I unfortunately have never had the opportunity to do it. But so in the colonial period, they had like actual clothes that they would make for the object. So for the statue would have to be undressed, and depending on what the community was like, it would either be a certain person, or it might be sometimes in Lima, for example, you would send your statue to somebody, to a particular woman's house who would dress her up, having been given the clothing that she was going to wear. And then they would also like curl her hair and put flowers and all kinds of adornments on them. So it's something that, as far as we understand it, right? So there's a lot of variation, but it's something that is very intimate, where you have the statue in front of you and you have to actually like undo the clasps, pull it off, right? And then like replace it with putting on another slip and then putting on a dress. Like, and they had all levels of everything, right? It wasn't just a dress. And if you, in those paintings, you could see most of what you saw was just the outside cape. But regardless, they still like, they would put on petticoats. They would have like all of the normal underlayers that like a noblewoman at that time would have worn. So it's something that would have taken a really long time. Does that help?
That's so fascinating. Do you know, so building on this Chachapoyan textile tradition, were I guess I have multiple questions. Were textiles exported from that area after the invasion? And do you know, were the textiles that the statues were dressed with, were those Chachapoyan or were those imported? Were they Spanish? I'm curious to hear more about the textiles.
Yeah, so Chachapoya textile. So the Chachapoya during the Inca period, one of the reasons why like the Inca were interested in that area, aside from they were spreading, is they really revered the Chachapoya textile tradition. When the Spanish arrived, they didn't see the importance of textiles the way that textiles were as important in the Indies, but they could still see that the Chachapoya made really good textiles. So in certain areas, like some in Cusco, some in Chachapoya's areas like that, where they were known for their textile traditions, they allowed the people who were making them to continue making certain things, because the textiles they were making were much finer than anything that was coming from Europe at that time. Now, in terms of the Lima confraternity, they absolutely had nothing that was actually from Chachapoyas. Everything was from, they had things from China, they had things from, China, which means like anywhere. It could have been anywhere in the Asian world, right? But they had things from Asia, they had things from France, they had things from Spain, they had things from the Netherlands for their textiles with which they dressed their Virgin. And it was always very explicitly, right? At least, and everything that I'm telling you is based on the archival research, and they keep these inventories, right? So we kind of have to take things with a grain of salt, because on the one hand, if you're putting her in something that came from Chachapoyas, you're not going to put that in an inventory that someone's going to look at and go, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. On the other hand, right, chances are those probably were the objects, all of these imported European objects or textiles that they were putting on the Virgin, because remember, in Lima, you have the Archbishop, you have the Viceroy, and the Inquisition. So you have a lot of Spanish officials who are really concerned with making sure that nobody's doing anything that isn't like following along the colonial lines.
Yeah. So this was a really expensive process, which brings me to a question that a panelist or that a participant has asked. Can you discuss who sponsors this elaborate dressing?
Yeah, so it comes from a particular, well, a couple of things. So before the miracle, it mostly came from the devotees. After the miracle, and this is a miracle that just took Lima by storm, as it were, right? Then I started seeing in the archival evidence that these textiles were being donated, like not just textiles either, it was also like jewelry, so like rings and pearls and crowns and everything that were being donated by even some elite Spanish people. the confraternity also, right, they collected dues from their members. So they were also able to like have small pots of money, and then they would buy some things. And they would actually say like, we bought X, Y, and Z thing for the Virgin on this day. And also you would have many cases where, at least in the Lima confraternity, the people, they would say like, so-and-so from the confraternity donated it. They made it, and they made it for her, that kind of thing, right? So it's kind of a mix of things, right? And then it's hard to know exactly which ones they chose to put on her. But the best guesses that I was able to make were based on the things that later show up in the same documentation, saying like, and then this one was torn, or this one was dirty, this one was spent, which suggests they were used.
This is fascinating. Okay, a few more questions. What do the heads represent on the bottom of the dress of the Virgin of the Rosary?
The heads. Oh, okay. Do you want me to bring up the image?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, give me a second. Okay. All right, can you see my PowerPoint again?
Yep.
Okay, so these heads down here, right? These heads are angels. So you'll see angels frequently. So what's interesting here about this image also, that you see here and here, but not here, is there you have this moon and these angels. And the moon is something that is, and angels are both connected to the iconography of the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. So, right, so what we're looking at is fascinating actually, because she's a Virgin of Copacabana who doesn't have her candle, but has rather been given the rosary of the Virgin of the Rosary and the headdress of the Virgin of the Rosary of Pomata. But she's also being affiliated with the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception through the addition of this moon and these angels. And the iconography for the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception comes from the iconography that was in the book of Revelation for the women of the apocalypse.
Wow. There are so many layers to this painting. It's just incredible. I have another question. We have participants who have questions too, but could you really quick talk about what this process looks like for you? I'm going to remove your pin so I can see you. Oops.
Do you want me to stop sharing too?
Yeah, now it's just me. There we go. Okay. How do you start to remove some of these layers in your research? What does it actually look like in the archive? Because I know a lot of these statues are missing, the textiles no longer exist. Throughout your dissertation research, for instance, what did you find and what sort of records were you looking at?
So I was looking at 16th and 17th century documents that were in various states of legible. Most of them were written by notaries, or almost all of them were written by notaries, but certain notaries were better than other ones. So the documents that I was looking at were, I mean, the kind of treasure trove is when they had inventory lists that said, these are the things that we have, but those are super rare. So actually the majority of what I was able to find in terms of who was in the confraternity, what kinds of things they had, came from disputes. So when you have like the leader of a confraternity is called a mayordomo. So when one mayordomo steps down and the next one comes into his place, the guy who's come into the other guy, right, who stepped up, has to like say, these are the things that I received from the previous guy. And a lot of times not everything would make it. So then you have like years of disputes going back and forth about like, I give you this, no, I give you that, like it's worth X, Y, or Z, which is, so it's a lot of like reading between the lines. I mean, everything that I worked on, it was really just like taking a mountain of evidence and distilling it, looking for these little tiny details. Like, so for example, the fact that she was named the Virgin of the Repose in the beginning isn't something that like they, wrote down one day. It was like as part of another, it was when the cathedral was actually trying to take control of the Virgin of Copacabana when she was in there for a while. And they had to be like, no, we have the artist who made it. So they brought the artist back and had the artist say, like, I'm the one who painted it, and I know for certain that they got it and that she was named this. And also this other guy was there and he saw her when I was making it, that kind of thing.
Wow. So that is a lot of reading in between the lines. That's just incredible. That's incredible and really difficult work. And as you mentioned, it's anti-colonial work. I have another question for you, but I do want to get to the participants. Were the women who dressed the statues called beatas by the Spanish?
So there were beatas for sure that were around, but some of the women, and this doesn't happen every time, this was on like special occasions, in the archival evidence that I was allowed to find, they would say, you know, we sent her to the house of una señora, a lady. But then you'd see like, we sent her to a lady over and over again, paid the same amount, right? It'll be like, you know, some amount of pesos, a couple chickens, that kind of thing. So beatas did also often have their own statues, and they would ritually dress them as well. They would change it, though theirs would often be images of the Christ child that they would have with them in their cells, and they would change his little clothes. But not all of the señoras who dress the images were beatas.
Okay. There was another question. Okay, perhaps this was asked a little bit earlier. Perhaps more than one artist created the painting? Question mark. Is that possible for the paintings to come out of like a workshop situation?
It is. It depends on like in this one in particular. If you have one, so there are a lot of like the Copacabana, the one that I was like, this is what it normally looks like. In that case, you'll have just like school, like, you know, these workshops will just like pump them out because everyone knows that they need it. The one at Joslyn is interesting because like I've never seen another one like that. When Annika actually contacted me about it for the first time, I was like, this is so great because it's so weird and this and this and this way. So this one was likely, and the, you know, based completely on just looking at it, the treatment of the paint looks such that I think it was one person, except there's often another person who adds the gold onto it, right? So there's the guy who does the painting, and then there's the guy who does the gold. So in that sense, yes, multiple people.
This ties into a question that I had and that a participant asked about the provenance of the work. So it came to Joslyn Art Museum in the 1960s. It was part of this gift of a few Spanish colonial paintings. But Ximena, I'm wondering if that's all we have in terms of information about the work. If you could speculate a little bit on how these paintings left Peru at some point. Are there these dress statue paintings in Europe? Did some of them go back to Spain? Are they common in other collections across the US? I'm curious about how these paintings have moved around.
Yeah, so there were a lot of these paintings in the Andes. And then, you know, colonial Spanish American art is this really interesting little realm where for a long time just nobody cared about it. And especially in the 60s, this painting wouldn't have been all that expensive when that person bought it. And now it's this like priceless object. So my guess is that it would have been somebody who went to Peru or who went to Bolivia, wherever they went, right? Or Pomata. And saw like, this is a great painting, picked it up for like not very much money, brought it back. And then that's how y'all got it. But you can see them in quite a number of collections. Yeah, because there's so many of these.
That's so fascinating. I know that there's more of a recent interest too in colonial Spanish painting, but also, I mean, what your work is really doing is bringing to light the multi-layered histories behind these artworks and the multicultural histories behind them. I mean, it's just so fascinating. There are so many layers to go into.
So much work to be done.
Yes, which brings me to my final question. I think we covered everything in the chat, but Ximena, what are the next steps for you? Where are you going with this research?
So this research is going to be part of my book. I have 2 case studies in this book. So my book, which I'm currently working on, but will come out based on my dissertation. So one is a case study that is the Virgin of Copacabana, and I follow her from the very moment that she is created until she makes it in the end, she makes it back to San Lázaro in the 1630s. And then the other case study is about the confraternity of the Virgen de la Antigua, or the Virgin of the Antigua, which belonged to a Black confraternity. And it was this it's a really great case where you have, originally it's just like a confraternity for Black people, or cofradía de negros, but then later turns into a confraternity for people of African descent who are from Senegambia. So that one I kind of do, in this case, it starts out Chachapoya and then it becomes, more broadly indigenous. For that one, it was like for Blacks and then for Blacks from this area. And then another chapter that kind of talks about like what Black and indigenous people are doing with art in Peru at that time, because a lot of art historians don't look at Peru, at Lima. Right? A lot of work that you'll see for colonial Peru is going to be Cusco. It's going to be the Highland Andes, right? And that's actually where you see that visible hybridity, where you have like various virgins wearing sometimes Andean textiles. In Lima, you never see that, which makes it a little less popular, but meant that like I kind of had the pick of what I wanted to work on. So these 2 images, I love them. They're wonderful, and they both exist. Were 2 of the most important ones in colonial Lima.
Well, that's so exciting. I can't wait to read it, and I can't wait until you can visit the painting in person at Joslyn Art Museum. For those of you who are here in Omaha, this painting is on view. It's just outside of the American galleries. There's a whole collection of Spanish colonial painting. So please visit us. Ximena, I hope this happens soon.
Yeah.
And I just thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your years of research with our audience. I know that everybody's very thankful. The chat is blowing up with thank yous. So thank you so much, and thanks to all for attending. And we'll end it there. Have a good night, everyone.